A billionaire wakes up, looks into his maid's eyes, and calls her his dead wife. But what happens next will change both their lives forever. Cyrus Grayson had not felt the sun on his face in 38 days. The morning it finally happened, pale golden light spilled across the polished mahogany floors of his Aspen estate, warming the vast master bedroom and brushing gently against the skin of the man lying unconscious in the grand canopied bed. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room, save for the occasional rustle of linens and a soft, steady whisper, one that belonged to the woman who hadn't left his side. Her name was Tamberlyn Holloway, 29 years old, maid by title but far more than that in spirit. She was seated quietly beside the bed in a simple gray sweater and jeans, her auburn curls tied loosely back. The nurses had gone for their routine shift change, leaving her alone with the man she once only saw from a respectful distance. Now she knew every inch of his face, each wrinkle, each scar, each freckle, by heart. She had been there the night the helicopter went down. Cyrus had been returning from a silent business retreat in Montana when engine failure sent the aircraft spiraling into the icy woods. Tamberlyn, who was cleaning the kitchen at the time, heard the crash before the security team did. Without hesitation, she ran into the dark, snow-laden forest and followed the smoke until she found him, broken, bleeding, barely breathing. While others panicked, she acted. She tore off her jacket, cradled his head, and whispered, "Stay with me, please," again and again until the sirens arrived. And now, 38 days later, she was still whispering. "Please come back," she murmured, her voice soft as a hymn. "The world needs you, Mr. Grayson, even if it doesn't always deserve you." She reached out and brushed a strand of graying hair from his forehead. The room smelled faintly of lavender and antiseptic, and the morning birds had begun chirping outside the large arched windows. Suddenly, the beeping changed. Her breath caught in her throat. She leaned in, eyes wide. His fingers twitched. Then, slowly, so slowly, it was as if the air around him shifted. His eyelids trembled. Tamberlyn stood frozen, hands to her mouth. His eyes opened. Blue-gray and disoriented, they wandered the room until they landed on her. He blinked several times, lips parting, but no words came. She knelt down beside him, trembling. "You're awake," she breathed. "Oh God, you're awake." He stared at her, his brows furrowed, confused, and then something strange happened. His hand reached for hers. "Lily," he rasped, barely audible. Tamberlyn froze. "What?" she whispered. He tightened his grip on her fingers. "Lily, you came back to me," he said, voice cracking. I thought I lost you forever." Tamberlyn's heart dropped into her stomach. Lillian Grayson, his wife, his great tragic love, the woman who died 3 years ago in a long, brutal battle with ovarian cancer. Tamberlyn had seen her photo on the grand piano. A regal, elegant woman with timeless beauty. Nothing like her. But in his eyes, those tired, fragile eyes, Tamberlyn saw no recognition of who she truly was. To him, she was Lily. She should have corrected him. She should have said, "No, I'm Tamberlyn, your maid." But instead, she whispered, "I'm here." And as he closed his eyes again, sighing in quiet relief, she remained on the floor, hand in his, caught between compassion and heartbreak, because she had saved his life. But now he was looking at her like she was his life. And Tamberlyn Holloway had no idea what to do next. The following morning unfolded slowly like a hesitant breath held too long. Cyrus Grayson slept soundly for the first time in weeks, unaware of the chaos quietly brewing just beneath the surface of the serene estate. Tamberlyn Holloway stood near the doorway, hugging a folded blanket to her chest, her heart pounding in quiet confusion. Every moment replayed in her mind. The way his hand had clung to hers. The way he'd said Lily's name, not with uncertainty, but conviction. He had believed it, believed she was his late wife. The nurses came and went in careful silence, stunned and grateful that their patient had finally awoken. The private neurologist, Dr. Wesley Thorne, arrived before sunrise and performed his examination with quiet intensity, moving his penlight over Cyrus's pupils, testing his grip, speech, and memory. "He's alert," Dr. Thorne later told Tamberlyn in a hushed tone. "But there's something else. He seems to be experiencing a form of dissociative confusion. Trauma-induced, most likely." What does that mean? She asked, her voice just above a whisper. It means he remembers a great deal, but some parts of his memory may be fractured, misplaced, especially emotionally significant ones. Like his wife's death. Tamberlin's breath caught. So, when he called me Lily, Dr. Thorne nodded gravely. It's not uncommon. The mind seeks comfort after trauma, and for him, Lily was likely the last true source of safety and love. And you've been by his side every day, speaking to him, holding his hand. That connection, combined with the memory gap, he's projected her identity onto you. Tamberlin swallowed hard. So, what do I do? Dr. Thorne looked at her gently. Correct him, eventually. But not now. For now, stability is more important than truth. She nodded numbly. By the time Cyrus stirred again, mid-morning sunlight poured through the windows, illuminating the room like some heavenly chapel. He opened his eyes and, as if by instinct, they searched for her. When he spotted her by the chair, his face broke into a fragile, almost childlike smile. There you are, he murmured. You always looked beautiful in the morning. Tamberlin's breath hitched. She turned away slightly, pretending to straighten the blanket she'd folded hours ago. Thank you, she said softly, not knowing what else to say. He slowly pushed himself up against the pillows, wincing at the effort. His body was stiff, and the weight of healing bones made each movement feel like lifting boulders. But his eyes never left her. I had the strangest dream, he said. You were there, but then again, you're always there, aren't you? She turned to him fully this time, her nerves tight as wire beneath her skin. Would you like something to drink? The nurses left tea. He laughed, quiet, raspy, but genuine. Still taking care of me, even now. You never change. Tamberlin felt like she was standing in someone else's life. The way he looked at her, full of history they never shared, memories she didn't own, it was disorienting and painful. And yet, part of her didn't want to shatter that look. Not yet. She brought him the tea on a silver tray, carefully placing it on the small table near his bed. As she leaned closer, he reached out and gently brushed her cheek with the back of his hand. You even smell like her, he whispered. Like rosemary in old books. Like the garden in autumn. Her chest ached. Do you remember the cabin in Vermont? He asked, his tone light, almost teasing. That night it snowed in April? You were furious. Said it ruined the daffodils. Tamberlin froze. She had never been to Vermont. I don't remember, she said cautiously. He smiled, his head falling back against the pillows. It's okay. I remember for both of us. She sat down beside him again, her hands folded so tightly they turned white. She should have told him the truth then. She should have said, I'm not your wife, Mr. Grayson. I'm your maid. I wash your dishes and change your sheets and mop the floors you walk on. But when he looked at her again, with eyes that softened in a way she'd never seen from him before, her voice failed her. And worse, her heart betrayed her, because Tamberlin had never known that kind of gaze. Not from her absent father, not from the string of men who came and went through her childhood home, not from the world, which often treated women like her as invisible. This powerful, broken man, the one she had once feared to even make eye contact with, now looked at her like she was his home. And so, she stayed quiet. The day passed in a haze of quiet conversation. Cyrus recalled stories of vacations, old friends, childhood dogs. He asked her to sing to him, an old jazz tune she'd hummed once while folding linens, and she did, with a voice she hadn't used in years. He cried quietly as she sang, and she cried with him, though he never saw it. When the night came and the room dimmed into golden lamplight, he drifted asleep again with her hand in his, whispering something about stars, about holding her in the snow. Tamberlin sat in the silence afterward, unable to move. The man she had rescued was awake, but he didn't know her. He only saw a ghost, and for now, she would be that ghost. Because if her presence gave him peace, even if just an illusion, then maybe for the first time in her life, her existence mattered to someone, even if it wasn't really her they loved. The snow began to fall again the next morning, soft, powdery flakes drifting lazily over the mountain peaks, cloaking the vast Grayson estate in winter's hush. Inside the house, all was warm and golden, a stark contrast to the frost-bitten world just beyond the tall, arched windows. Cyrus Grayson sat propped against a mountain of pillows in bed, sipping chamomile tea from a porcelain cup with shaking hands. The strength was slowly returning to his limbs, but his memory remained clouded. stubbornly rearranged. Tamberlin Holloway stood nearby, folding a blanket at the foot of the bed, her motions deliberate, almost mechanical. Every glance he gave her, filled with admiration, affection, history, made her stomach twist in 1,000 painful ways. The guilt that had taken root in her chest was growing with each passing day, tangled around her ribs like vines. "Lily," he said suddenly, setting the cup down on the tray beside him, "come sit with me, just for a moment." Tamberlin hesitated. Her name, Lily, was not hers, yet it had become the one he called her most. It was beginning to feel like a lie she had agreed to live inside. She crossed the room silently and sat at the edge of the mattress, hands folded in her lap. He reached for her fingers almost instinctively, interlacing them with his. "I had a dream about the vineyard in Sonoma," he murmured, smiling faintly. "You wore that ridiculous straw hat and spilled rosé on your dress. You made us leave early because you swore bees were following you." Tamberlin let out a soft laugh, part amused, part broken. "That wasn't me," she whispered so quietly he didn't catch it. He chuckled, eyes still distant in memory. "Oh, God, I missed this. Missed you. It's like I was asleep for years, and now everything is bright again." "You're my son, Lily. You always were." She couldn't take it. "Not today." "I need some air," she said suddenly, rising too quickly. Cyrus blinked in confusion. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she lied, already moving toward the door. "Just need to check on something in the kitchen." She practically fled down the hallway, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't stop until she reached the servants' staircase, hidden behind the main foyer, and slumped down onto the steps, burying her face in her hands. This was getting worse. He wasn't just mistaking her for Lillian in fleeting moments. He had anchored himself in the belief that she was his wife, and every time she tried to gently correct him, his eyes darkened, his voice cracked, and a storm of grief washed over him so overwhelming she couldn't bear to be its cause. Tamberlin had never been someone anyone depended on, never someone people looked for when they needed comfort. But now this powerful, broken man believed she was the very center of his world. She had once prayed to matter. She never expected it to come like this. Back upstairs, Cyrus stared at the empty space beside him, the warmth of her fingers still lingering in his palm. There was a part of him, just a sliver, that knew something was off. Some details felt slippery. Faces he should know were blurry. Certain memories didn't quite stitch together. But grief had shaped his heart so violently over the years that he wanted to believe the impossible, that Lillian had somehow returned to him, that life had bent its cruel rules just this once. He didn't want doctors or truth. He wanted her. Later that day, Tamberlin returned with a tray of roasted vegetables and homemade soup she had cooked herself, an old recipe from her grandmother in Kansas. Cyrus lit up the moment he saw her. "Are you cooked?" he asked, smiling like a boy. She nodded. "It's nothing fancy." He tasted the soup and his eyes fluttered shut. "God, I miss this. You used to make it every winter." No, she hadn't. But the warmth in his voice made it feel as though she had. The lines of memory blurred further with every shared bite, every quiet laugh. As evening fell, a gentle snowstorm began. Cyrus asked her to read aloud to him, an old book of poetry by Langston Hughes that Lillian once kept in the library. Tamberlin's voice trembled on the first few lines, but he closed his eyes and listened, smiling softly like a man at peace. But behind the door, someone else was watching. Verne, the head butler, had been with the Graysons for over 2 decades. He had seen Tamberlin arrive as a timid housemaid 3 years ago. Underpaid, overworked, often silent. Now he watched her from the shadows with a mix of awe and concern. He saw the way Cyrus looked at her, and he saw the war raging behind Tamberlin's eyes. After Cyrus drifted off to sleep, Verne approached her quietly in the hallway. "You can't keep this up," he said gently. Tamberlin turned sharply. "No, I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm not lying." "But you're not telling the truth either," Verna said, his voice kind but firm. "He thinks you're her." "I never claimed to be," she snapped, then caught herself. Her voice softened. "He needed someone. He needed peace. He was terrified and broken, and I gave him something to hold on to. Just until he got better." Verne sighed. "And when he does? When his memory returns fully? I'll tell him everything," she said. "I swear." But deep down, even she didn't know if that was a promise she could keep, because with every sunrise, she felt herself falling deeper into a life that was never meant to be hers. And with every sunset, she feared more and more what would happen when the illusion shattered. The knock came sharply, 3 times, like a gavel striking wood. It echoed down the marble hallway and into the quiet of the West Wing, where Tamberlin had been carefully changing Cyrus's bedsheets. She paused, glancing toward the door, heart tightening instinctively. Few people visited the Grayson estate unannounced, especially now, with Cyrus still healing and the staff under strict orders to keep the household calm and undisturbed. A moment later, Vern appeared at the doorway, his face unreadable but tense. "There's a visitor," he said with a stiff bow of his head. She insisted on seeing Mr. Grayson personally. "Claims to be family." Tamberlin's hands stilled on the folded sheet. "Family?" "Carmelia Wister," Vern said. "Lillian's cousin." The name hit her like a chill. Carmelia had been spoken of only in passing. Lillian's estranged cousin, born into old money and a venomous kind of ambition. She had been cut off from the Graysons years ago after a brutal falling out over trust funds, wills, and a failed business venture. But even from the little Tamberlin had overheard in late-night whispers or half-conversations among the staff, the woman's presence had always been like a cold draft under a locked door, unseen but inescapably felt. Tamberlin wiped her palms on her apron and followed Verna down the hall. The woman waiting in the foyer was the embodiment of icy elegance. Mid-40s, sharp cheekbones, platinum blonde hair pulled into a flawless twist. Her coat was velvet, midnight blue, with silver embroidery curling along the cuffs like frost. Her eyes, pale and glinting, swept the room the way a hawk might scan for prey. When she saw Tamberlin approaching, her lips twitched into a smirk that was anything but warm. "You," she said. "I remember you." "The help." Tamberlin stood tall, swallowing the wave of defensiveness rising in her chest. "Cyrus is resting. He only just regained consciousness." "Oh, I'm sure he is," Carmelia replied, taking slow, pointed steps across the marble. "And I'm sure you've been very helpful during his recovery. Reading him bedtime stories, fluffing his pillows, whispering sweet nothings into his ear while he's too broken to know better." Vern stepped between them. "Miss Wister," she held up a hand. "Save it. I want to see him. Now." Tamberlin hesitated. Then Cyrus's voice, faint but firm, echoed from the second-floor balcony. "Let her up." All eyes turned upward. He stood there, leaning heavily on his cane, a robe wrapped around his thin frame. He looked older than he had only weeks ago, but stronger, more present. Tamberlin's heart quickened. Carmelia gave her one last withering glance, then ascended the staircase, heels clicking like ticking clock hands. In the sitting room, Cyrus sat in his armchair by the fireplace, the room crackling with low heat and tension. Carmelia entered with the grace of someone who believed the world owed her reverence. "Well," she said, feigning concern. "Now look who finally decided to return from the dead." Cyrus chuckled dryly. "I see you haven't changed." "And I see you have," she said, eyeing him, "though it seems not entirely for the better. I've been hearing interesting things." He raised an eyebrow. "Such as?" She tilted her head. "You mistaking the maid for Lillian, for instance. Treating her like your wife. Giving her free reign of the house. Sharing private moments. Cyrus, this is concerning behavior." His jaw clenched slightly. "I don't recall inviting you here to lecture me." "You didn't," she replied coolly. "But someone had to step in before this little charade went too far." He stood slowly, placing both hands on his cane. "What exactly are you accusing her of?" Carmelia laughed without humor. "Do I really need to spell it out? She's a maid, a girl from nowhere. And now she's playing house in your bed, while you're too confused to see she's manipulating you." Tamberlin, who had silently stepped into the doorway, paled. Cyrus's eyes darkened. "Be careful, Carmelia." "Or what?" she snapped. "You'll throw me out? Cut me off again?" "She's not Lillian, Cyrus. She's a stranger wearing your grief like a crown." Silence swallowed the room. Then, slowly, Cyrus turned to Tamberlin, who stood frozen just inside the room's edge. "Is it true?" he asked, voice hoarse. "Tell me the truth now, Tamberlin, please." Her eyes met his, wide and tearful. She stepped forward, her voice shaking but steady. "Yes," she said, "it's true." He flinched. "I'm not Lillian," she continued. "I never claimed to be. I tried to tell you, at first. But you looked at me like I was the only thing keeping you from falling apart. And I didn't have the heart to take that from you." He blinked, looking suddenly very old, very tired. "So, this whole time, I cared for you, she said, voice breaking. That part is real. Every word I said to you, every moment I sat beside your bed, I wasn't pretending. I was just being there, like no one ever was for me. A long, cold pause. Then Cyrus stepped back, the cane trembling slightly beneath his grip. I need time, he said, eyes on the floor. Tamberlin nodded. I understand. Carmelia watched her with smug satisfaction as Tamberlin turned and quietly exited the room. But when the door closed, Cyrus's voice cut the silence like a blade. Get out, Carmelia. She looked shocked. Excuse me. I may be confused, he said slowly, but I'm not blind. You came here not for me, but for control. And I won't let you twist this house into your game board again. Leave. She opened her mouth to protest, but his expression stopped her cold. She left. Downstairs, Tamberlin stood in the hallway alone, one hand pressed over her chest, her breath shallow. She had told him the truth, and he had turned away. Not in anger, not in hatred, but in heartbreak, and that somehow hurt more than anything else in the world. The mansion felt different after that day, quieter. Not the kind of quiet that comes with peace, but the heavy, suffocating kind, the silence of absence, of things unsaid, of doors no longer opened. Tamberlin Holloway had left before sunrise, packing her few belongings into a small, worn canvas duffel and slipping out through the back gate as if she were escaping a place she'd never belonged to. There was no dramatic farewell, no confrontation, just a handwritten note left on the kitchen counter for Vernon. Thank you for your kindness. I'll always remember it. Please tell Mr. Grayson I'm sorry for everything. T. She didn't even have the strength to say goodbye to Cyrus. Now she stood in the cold lobby of St. Delilah's Hope Shelter on the outskirts of Boulder, wrapped in a borrowed coat, her hands chapped red from wind and overwork. Her room here was barely more than a closet. Cinder block walls, a single bed, a small desk, and a flickering lamp that hummed faintly through the night. But it was familiar, and it was hers. No marble floors, no paintings with names and plaques, just a quiet kind of nothingness that Tamberlin had grown up in. She tried not to think of the mansion or of Cyrus, but he haunted her in the smallest ways. The smell of rosemary in someone's hair, the soft jazz songs they had shared by the fire, the weight of his hand when he'd held hers, like it was the only thing tethering him to life. She tried to tell herself that it was for the best, that he needed clarity, space, a return to the life he'd had before her. And she had returned to the life she'd always known. But every night as she lay on the creaky cot with the thin wool blanket pulled to her chin, she couldn't help but whisper into the dark, I miss you. Meanwhile, in Aspen, the Grayson estate was in a slow state of decay. Cyrus didn't notice it at first. He went through the motions, taking his medications, attending therapy, walking the gardens with Vern. But something vital had been excised from the house, something warm and unspoken. Meals lost their taste. Music became noise. The fireplace seemed colder, even when lit. And then he found the notebook. It had been wedged between the cushion of the window seat in the library. Small, leather-bound, the edges worn. At first he thought it was one of Lillian's old journals, but when he opened it, his breath caught. The handwriting was unfamiliar, neat, but unrefined, and every page told a story. Tamberlin's story. She had written it all. How she found him that night in the snow. How she stayed by his side every day in the hospital. How she couldn't bring herself to correct him when he first called her Lily. Her words were raw and honest, sometimes painful, but never manipulative. There was no scheme, no plot. Only someone who had spent her life invisible, and for a brief moment had been seen. Cyrus sat for a long time with the notebook in his lap, sunlight pouring over the inked pages like mercy. He remembered how warm her voice had been, how she always seemed to smell like cinnamon and soap, how she never asked for anything, even when he offered. The weight of her absence was no longer an ache, it was a fracture. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the pines, he sat across from Verna in the drawing room, the fire crackling softly between them. She saved me, Cyrus said quietly, staring into the flames. She did, Verna replied, not needing clarification. I pushed her away. You were hurting. I still am. Vernon nodded once, his voice gentle. Then go find her, before it's too late. Cyrus didn't sleep that night. At dawn, He dressed himself in plain clothes, dark jeans, a navy sweater, a wool coat. No designer labels, no chauffeur. Just his own 2 feet and a purpose he hadn't felt in months. He arrived at the shelter as the sky turned lavender and gold. The receptionist, startled by the sudden appearance of a man with the poise of wealth but the eyes of a beggar, led him down a narrow hallway to a metal door marked Room 3C. He hesitated, hand raised, then knocked. Tamberlin opened the door slowly, still in her pajamas, hair tousled, eyes sleepy and guarded. When she saw him, the air left her lungs. "Mr. Grayson?" "No," he said quietly, voice breaking. "Just Cyrus. Please. Just Cyrus." She stood frozen, gripping the doorknob. "I read your journal," he said, "every word. You didn't trick me. You saved me, again and again." "I didn't mean for any of it to happen," she whispered. "I know." And I was angry. Not because you lied, but because you were the only thing in my life that felt real, and I didn't want to lose that. You made me feel human again. A tear slipped down her cheek. She brushed it away roughly. "So I don't belong in your world." He took a step closer. "Then I'll leave that world behind." Silence. "Come home with me," he said. "Not to be anyone else, not to be Lily, but to be you. Tamberlin Holloway, the woman who found me when I was lost, the woman who reminded me how to live." Her voice trembled. "And if I say no, I'll still be grateful for the rest of my life that you loved me enough to pretend. But I'll always wonder if we could have written something real." She looked down. Then slowly, her hand reached out and closed around his. And for the first time in weeks, the silence lifted. The car ride back to Aspen was quiet, but it wasn't the silence of discomfort. It was the silence of two people breathing in the same rhythm, of the cold mountains rolling past like old witnesses, and of wounds beginning at last to close. Tamberlin sat in the passenger seat of Cyrus's simple black SUV, her hands folded in her lap, the seat warmer, humming beneath her. Her suitcase, just one small canvas bag, sat in the back seat, carrying the only belongings she had to her name. She hadn't even asked where they were going. When she took his hand and followed him out of the shelter, it hadn't been about destinations. It had been about choice, about trust. Cyrus drove slowly, deliberately, eyes fixed on the winding mountain roads. The lines on his face had softened since their last goodbye, but a certain sadness still lived in his gaze. Like a man who had walked through fire and come out the other side, carrying every burn as a part of himself. When they finally pulled into the long, tree-lined drive of the Grayson estate, Tamberlin felt her chest tighten. The house loomed large and majestic against the snow-covered landscape. But it no longer frightened her. It didn't feel like a place she didn't belong. It felt like a question, waiting to be answered. Vern opened the door before they even reached the steps, his stoic face twitching into the smallest of smiles when he saw her. He nodded once and stepped aside, allowing them to enter without a word. The house had changed. Flowers bloomed fresh in vases she remembered dusting. The fireplace crackled with warmth in every room. Light streamed in through cleaned windows, and soft music played somewhere distant, piano and cello. It was as though the home had been asleep, just like Cyrus. And now, it too had finally woken up. He led her not to the guest quarters, but to the east wing, a quiet, sun-drenched part of the estate with vaulted ceilings and a private garden just outside the windows. The room he opened for her had once belonged to Lillian. He said it gently, almost with reverence, but it had been redesigned. Gone were the antique vanity and floral drapes. In their place were clean white walls, fresh linens, and a writing desk facing the mountains. "I wanted you to feel like this is your home," Cyrus said, "not hers. Yours." Tamberlin stood in the doorway for a long time, her eyes scanning every corner. It wasn't luxury that moved her, it was thoughtfulness. Everything in the room felt quiet, intentional, personal, safe. "Thank you," she whispered. He didn't ask her for more than she could give. That night, they had dinner in the kitchen, just the two of them. He made pasta, clumsily, nearly burning the garlic, and she laughed for the first time in weeks. They talked about books and music, not grief. He asked about her childhood, about Kansas, about her mother's laugh, about the little diner she used to dream of owning someday. She asked him about the first computer he ever built, and how it felt to become a billionaire before 30. They didn't talk about Lillian. Not yet. Later, as the evening settled around them, Cyrus walked her back to her room. At the door, he paused. I don't want you to feel pressured, he said. This house, this life, it's not a trade for what you gave me. You owe me nothing. But if you choose to stay, I promise I'll never make you disappear behind someone else's memory again. Tamberlin looked up at him and for the first time truly believed him. I'm not here because I want to be someone else, she said. I'm here because for the first time in my life someone saw me. And I want to be that woman. He nodded, silent. Then, carefully, respectfully, he reached out and placed a kiss on her forehead. Good night, Tamberlin. She watched him walk away down the hall, a man still healing, still learning how to carry love without guilt. That night, she sat by the window of her new room and wrote in a fresh notebook, her first in months. I am not a ghost. I am not a placeholder. I am a woman who is brave enough to stay. And now, I am brave enough to begin. Outside, snow continued to fall, soft as memory. And inside, a new story had quietly begun to write itself. The following weeks unfolded like a slow bloom in spring, tentative, cautious, and quietly radiant. Life in the Grayson estate settled into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar to both Tamberlin and Cirrus, yet somehow deeply right. They moved around each other not like lovers, not yet, but like two people rediscovering the very language of being alive. Every glance held weight. Every shared silence offered comfort rather than awkwardness. And in that delicate balance, something more honest than romance began to take root. Trust. Cyrus threw himself into something Tamberlin hadn't seen from him before. Reconstruction not of buildings or technology, but of people. He began dissolving old contracts, stepping back from the cold machine of Grayson Dynamics. He called meetings with his board of directors, and after several heated arguments and difficult decisions, he signed over partial ownership of the company to a trust fund for young women from underprivileged backgrounds, starting with an educational, scholarship-bearing Tamberlin's name. I won't let the only meaningful thing that's ever happened to me stop at a story no one hears, he told her one evening, as they walked the snowy path behind the estate, pine trees heavy with frost. But I didn't do anything that special, Tamberlin said softly. Cyrus looked at her then, pausing mid-step. You stayed. When everyone else left, you gave without asking. That's rarer than brilliance, rarer than any invention I've ever created. It wasn't always easy. Whispers reached them. The press had caught wind of the situation. A billionaire's mysterious live-in maid, headlines called her, with tones that ranged from skeptical to cruel. They published blurry photos of her exiting grocery stores, reprinted old job applications, even tracked down distant relatives she hadn't spoken to in years. Reporters parked outside the estate's gates, hoping for a glimpse of a scandal they didn't understand. One afternoon, as Tamberlin stepped outside to bring fresh flowers to the greenhouse, a journalist with a long-lens camera shouted from behind the fence, "How does it feel to be the maid who married her way into a fortune?" The words struck like a slap. Tamberlin stopped cold. The bouquet trembled in her hands. But before she could answer or flee, Cyrus appeared at her side. She's not my maid, he said clearly, his voice echoing over the lawn. She's the only reason I'm still standing. The footage of that moment would go viral within hours. But Cyrus didn't flinch. He canceled interviews, declined profiles, and stopped attending elite events. When asked why, he simply said, I found something more important than public opinion. But the real battle came from within. Carmelia Wister, Lillian's cousin, filed a legal petition within the month. Claiming mental instability, she sought conservatorship over Cyrus's estate. She accused Tamberlin of manipulation, coercion, and exploitation of a vulnerable man. Her lawyers arrived with thick folders, private investigators, and a hunger for headlines. Tamberlin was called to testify. Cyrus offered to shield her, to have his lawyers speak for both of them. But she shook her head. If I'm going to stand beside you, she said, I need to stand on my own. The court hearing was held in a quiet chamber downtown, sealed from the public to avoid media chaos. But the tension in the room was palpable. Carmelia sat with a team of sharp-suited attorneys, her face set like stone. Tamberlin, in a modest dress and a coat 2 winters old, sat alone at a simple wooden table. She spoke gently, honestly, about her past, about the accident, about the days spent at Cyrus's bedside. She admitted to not correcting him when he first mistook her for Lillian. She did not hide her shame. I didn't lie for money. I never wanted anything from him, she said softly. I just didn't want him to die feeling alone. The judge, a woman in her 60s with a stern but perceptive face, watched her closely. After a long pause, she asked, "And what about now? What keeps you here now?" Tamberlin didn't hesitate. Because now, I'm not alone either." Cyrus was next. He rose with the help of his cane, his voice low but steady. "I've made billions by understanding how systems work, but nothing in this world, not one formula or investment, has ever given me the peace I found in her presence. If that's weakness, then I welcome it." The ruling came 3 days later. The judge dismissed Carmelia's petition with prejudice, citing no signs of manipulation or incapacity. In her final statement, she wrote, "This court recognizes that the deepest recoveries often arise not from doctors or treatments, but from human connection. Mr. Grayson is of sound mind, and at long last, of sound heart." That evening, Tamberlin returned home to find the staff waiting quietly in the foyer. Vern offered a proud nod, the chef clapped softly, and the housekeeper slipped a white rose into her hand without saying a word. Upstairs, Cyrus waited by the fireplace. When she walked in, his eyes met hers, tired but shining. "Was it awful?" he asked. "Only a little," she smiled. He held out a hand. She crossed the room and took it, letting him pull her gently down beside him. "Thank you," he said, "for choosing to stay." Again! She leaned into his shoulder and, for the first time, rested her head there without fear. Outside, the wind howled across the mountains. But inside, in the warmth of firelight and fragile truth, they were no longer afraid. Spring arrived quietly in Aspen, the snow melting from the high ridges, flowing in silver ribbons through the trees and gardens of the Grayson estate. Crocuses emerged first, small and trembling, and then came the bold tulips and daffodils, splashing color like brushstrokes across the once white landscape. With the changing of the seasons came a gentle shift inside the house as well, a thawing of something long frozen between two souls who had been strangers once, now bound not by illusion or necessity, but by love earned the long, hard way. Tamberlin stood in the East Wing garden early one morning, barefoot on the damp stones, holding a cup of tea with both hands. She watched the way the sunlight turned the dew to gold and let herself breathe for the first time in what felt like years. This garden had been Lillian's favorite once, a place of memory and ghosts. But now it was something else. Cyrus had let it grow wild in places, added beds of lavender and wild sage, even planted a small pear tree in the corner. After Tamberlin mentioned once, almost absent-mindedly, that she'd always wanted one as a child. She hadn't asked him to do it. That was the point. The door behind her opened quietly, and she heard his familiar gait, the soft scuff of one foot dragging slightly as he leaned on the cane. Cyrus was walking better these days, not because he was pushing himself, but because he was healing the way people do when they have someone to walk toward. "You're up early," he said, his voice still thick with sleep. She smiled, but didn't turn around. The light was too beautiful to miss. He stepped beside her, their shoulders brushing. She felt the warmth of him, not just his skin, but the calm he carried now, a steadiness that had taken months to build. The pain and shame from the accident, the grief for Lillian, the public's judgment, the courtroom, the distance between who he was and who he'd become, all of it had shaped him, refined him. "Do you ever think," he asked quietly, "how strange it is? The way life leads us where we're meant to be by breaking us first." Tamberlin looked at him finally, her eyes soft. "I used to think life just broke us and left us there. But then I met you." He leaned down, pressing a kiss to her temple, his hand curling gently around hers. That afternoon, Cyrus called the staff together for a quiet announcement. He was selling the Aspen estate. The news sent murmurs through the hall, stunned silence from Vern, and wide-eyed shock from Tamberlin, who stood beside him holding his hand. "We've built a life here," he explained calmly. "But it's not the life we want next. This house was designed for someone I used to be, a man who hid behind stone and money and ghosts. I don't want to be that man anymore." Tamberlin realized then that he wasn't just closing a chapter, he was setting fire to the pages, not in anger, but in liberation. They bought a modest farmhouse on the edge of a lake in Vermont, where winters were long but quiet and summers exploded in green and gold. It had creaky floors, a crooked porch, and acres of untamed wildflowers. There was no staff, no press, no gates, just a house and land, a place where the world wouldn't look for either of them. On their second evening there, after unpacking dusty boxes of books and arranging chipped mugs in the kitchen cabinets, They sat on the porch, watching fireflies rise from the grass. Cyrus turned to her, holding something small in his palm. It wasn't a diamond ring, it was a silver locket, old and unpolished. Inside was a photo of Tamberlin laughing, taken by Vern one day without her knowing, and beside it a slip of paper in Cyrus's handwriting. "Thank you for saving me. I wanted to marry you the day I woke up," he said, "but I needed to be the man worthy of standing next to you first." She blinked back tears, her hand covering her mouth. "I don't need a grand ceremony," he said softly. "Just you. Just this. Just now." She nodded, voice caught in her throat. "Yes, of course, yes." They married barefoot by the lake a month later. Just them, two local witnesses, and a storm of cherry blossoms caught in the wind like confetti from the trees. No vows were written down, no elaborate speeches, just whispered promises and the clasping of hands that had both once known loneliness too well. In the years that followed, they built something ordinary and extraordinary at once. Tamberlin returned to writing, her words now filled with strength and light. She began mentoring girls from the scholarship program Cyrus had created in her name. Many came from broken homes, some from the same shelters she once stayed in. She gave them notebooks and tea and a place to speak truth. Cyrus spent mornings tending the garden, afternoons reading in the hammock, and evenings beside Tamberlin in the kitchen or on long walks by the lake. He donated quietly, anonymously. He refused interviews. He never gave another public speech again. But every year, on the anniversary of the day she left the shelter with him, he wrote a letter to her, to the girl he met in a dream, who turned out to be more real than anything he had ever known. And on one of those anniversaries, as they watched their young daughter chase butterflies beneath the pear tree planted in the yard, he turned to Tamberlin with mist in his eyes. "She has your strength," he said, "but your heart? I'm still not sure it's real. How can something so good be real?" Tamberlin leaned into him, smiling softly. "It wasn't always good," she whispered, "but it was always real." And with that, the story, born of confusion, grief, and impossible chance, finally fully became something beautiful. Not perfect, not easy, but deeply, unmistakably theirs. In my view, the ending of this story is not just satisfying, it's earned. It doesn't rely on sudden miracles or convenient resolutions, but instead unfolds from honest growth, pain, and the quiet resilience of two wounded souls, learning how to love not in spite of their scars, but because of them. What strikes me most is how the story rejects traditional power dynamics. Tamberlin never needed rescuing in the fairy tale sense. She was never a damsel in distress, and Cyrus was never a flawless prince. Instead, their relationship redefined strength. Her strength came through quiet loyalty and unwavering presence. His came through humility, through the courage to change. The final chapter doesn't end at marriage or redemption. It continues into the everyday, the ordinary, the sacred repetition of real life. That's what makes it beautiful. It reminds us that true love is not grand gestures, but quiet constancy. That home isn't built from stone or wealth, but from choice, time, and care. In a world that often rewards the loudest voices and the glossiest stories, this one whispered, and that's why it stayed with me.